So let's begin, and a warm welcome to all of you to the finals of the Indian Debating League. It's my pleasure to introduce your adjudicators today for the evening as the senior most batch goes live. So Dhruva and Varshini, we've had debaters, approximately 3,500 of them, who've debated their way through in the last fortnight or 20 days to get to this point. You are meeting the top 2 state teams over here. Now, to introduce you, Dhruva, obviously, we all know you as having been a part of the Indian debating team in 2011, 12, 13. You've been a coach for the India team, WSDC 2016, 17, Mini Worlds Chennai, WSDC in 2017, 8, and 19 as well. A finalist as US University Debating Championships and North American University Debating Championships were quite a natural for you. I can just go on with that list. Currently, you're pursuing your PhD at Oxford and having graduated from Harvard University with a Bachelor in Economics. It's our pleasure to have you here with us. Varshini is the director of the Indian Schools Debating Society. She's obviously heading it, and she was on the first ever India team. So you couldn't have had more seasoned people than Dhruva and Varshini coming in. She's also the first ever Indian to have served on the motions committee and the chief adjudication team in the World Championships. Having coached the India team from 14 to 17, we can see that she's been, doing a lot of debating and a lot of mentoring, which is what reflects in the quality of ISDS, which is very well known. Yes, just from an education standpoint, you must know that she had done her, Masters in Development Studies from IIT Madras. So it's amazing to see the journey that you've gone through, Varshini. It's inspirational for all the attendees today. Now, coming to our teams, we have the most aggressive teams, Delhi and Bengal, competing today. It was, quite, I would say it was just so pertinent to pick up this topic that we have today, considering it's all around us. And we saw the COP26 also go live with it. The motion for today is this House believes that environmental advocacy groups should prioritize lobbying governments to change environmental policies rather than convincing individuals to take individual responsibility for their own contribution to environmental damage. That has been updated on your adjudication sheets as well for your reference. Today for the debate, obviously every speaker is going for 6 minutes. The POS are not allowed in the first and the last minute, and we are doing reply speeches for half the time of 6 minutes today. So Varshini, with that, I'm assuming you are holding the clock. Would that be okay? It's very visible to all of us. You have the speaker sequence as well. So I'll hand over the session in that sense to you for you to call upon the speakers as we go forward.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Anjali. And thank you for the introductions for both of us. It is an honor to be here. Best of luck to all the participants. And in my role as chair of this round, and without further ado, may I please invite the first speaker from Proposition, Ahana, to open the case for Proposition. Here.
Ma'am, am I visible and audible clearly?
Yes, you're crystal clear.
Okay, so may I start? One, two, three, start. The time has come when we need to take some decisive action just to save our planet Earth from further degradation. Many of us, especially the environmental activists, tirelessly pursuing to accomplish the said objective. Options are simple. Modality 1, create awareness among individuals, the end users, consumers, so that they refrain from any deeds which may cause any sort of serious impact on environmental issues. Modality 2, pursue the government, the regulators, the watchdog agencies to come out with some strict regulation, the statutory restriction and stern legislation, and to implement it with a genuine political will. With this, a very good evening to one and all present over here. I am Ahuna Roy on behalf of Team West Bengal. Absolutely agree with today's motion. Awareness creation at individual level, community level may sound good, but accomplishing the desired objectives, especially in the environmental front, is not an easy task. Recently, we have witnessed some unpleasant flooding in some of our metro cities like Kolkata, Mumbai, and even in the national capital, New Delhi. The main culprit in the said episode is the single-use plastic bag of 50 micron and the PET bottle. It has caused unprecedented choking of the drainage system and even spoiled the high capacity of suction pumps. Think of how much resources were spent in the creation of awareness, starting from the school level to the community level, just not to use and dispose those hazardous substances recklessly in our daily life. But see the outcome. Who were the sufferers, starting from pavement dweller to the high-rise occupants? If this be the case of metro cities, the situation in other places can be easily understandable. If we are seriously concerned about the potential threat of single-use plastic bags, PET bottle, it is the high time to compel the government to pass some strict legislation to stop the production, storage, and distribution of those disturbing substances. Else, this vicious cycle will just go on. The food grain industry has solved this issue in a similar manner by some historic legislation in the way back in 1987 with the passage of Jute Packaging Material Act 1987, where 60% of the food grains need to be compulsorily packaged in environmentally friendly jute bags. In our country, with proliferative religious diversity, religious festival with idol worship and idol immersion are a very popular phenomenon. But the toxic dyes used in the idol painting also goes to the water bodies on immersion, and severe biomagnification of these toxic substances are rampant. Many of them are carcinogenic even. Lots of awareness were created. Symbolic immersion was suggested, but in the name of religious rituals, hardly anything has changed. But if some stern legislation was there regarding procurement and consumption of such toxic dyes, the objective could much easily be achieved. Legislation has its strength. Law has its own power. Look at our neighbor Bhutan. It is a plastic-free state where production, distribution, storage, and obviously the consumption of plastic bags are prohibited by the law. And see their success level in the environmental front. Look at another neighbor, Bangladesh, where stern government law is there in banning the usage of fishing net below a certain hole size, which helped to spare the prawn fries in the breeding season. Seasonal ban on fishing of hilshas on the breeding season made a magical outcome. They are now the chief exporter of hilsha for India. With intense awareness creation, we, the Indian side, are just reeling in the silver crop. And we have seen it in the last rainy season. Many of our houses haven't tasted it. Thus, paradigm shift to be initiated. Focus to be shifted from demand side to supply side, from end users to the producers. Else we will just go on with the fallacy of putting the cart before the horse. Now I would like to invite some POI.
How do you propose that on your side of the house, when you have legislations to support climate change, that these laws cannot be repealed or revoked right after they're done on the basis of government whims and fancies?
Can you please repeat your question once more?
How do you propose that on your side of the house, when you use legislation to promote climate change, etc., that these legislations are not changed after a specific period of time on government whims and fancies?
See, that is a different issue. Legislation will be changed or not. That is not in our hand, neither in the hand of government. But when a legislation is being imposed, it can be done. You can see in the example of tobacco, legislation need to be imposed, because over here in the tobacco, though we are putting various kind of like cancerous pictures, everything, but until and unless government is putting some law, it is not done. Because in the case of opium has been totally banned in India by the law, and still now the law has not been changed. It has been banned way back. Many government has come the way. Thing has not changed. Still, it is going on. But in the case of Afghanistan, see, it is rampantly being used. Once India opium was like a biggest producer, auctions were done. But over here, see, the tobacco, we have not done. So we need to put some law to stop the people, else we will not go. Thus, production need to be like hampered. If we do not stop the production, this reckless thing will go on. I want to focus today that government should impose some regulation on the production, that if we stop from the production side, then if production is not there, if the thing is not coming in the market, then no demand will be generated. But if we check from the demand side, which we were trying to, by creating awareness, we are trying to stop consumption. But what has happened? It has yielded no, means like nothing. It can be easily seen in the example of tobacco. We have created many awareness regarding tobacco, but it has not yielded any effort. So that is the thing. So thus, today I want to conclude that government need to ban on production rather than on consumption, because by reckless effort on people to stop consumption, it hasn't yielded any effort. Thus, we need to put some strict law to stop the production. With this, thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech. A quick reminder on timings. As the judges, we will stop taking notes at 6 minutes and 15 seconds. So just reminder to wrap your speech up by then. May I please request the first speaker from team opposition, Tamanna, to open the case for opposition. Here.
I'm the first speaker for side opposition.
Is that Sarah?
Yes. Yes.
I'm so sorry, my bad. Can I please request the first speaker from opposition, Sarah, to open the case for team opposition?
Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Side proposition seems to believe that the entire debate about climate change simply exists on the production of things such as plastic bags and jute bags. However, that is simply not the case. In the specific cases, when you're trying to divert attention to, for example, climate change that is occurring in places where a lot of ice is being melted, or when people are dying because of this, it is simply not possible for side proposition to come up and propose that we impose legislation in order to stop the production of jute bags, which is supposed to supposedly help reduce climate change in these parts. This is simply not what this debate is about, and that is what I would like to begin with. That was the first point of rebuttal. Secondly, then, side proposition in response to our POI said that when legislation changes, that is not in their hands. However, when these environmental change groups spend millions of dollars of money trying to court and trying to lobby governments by asking them to favor climate change, it is simply not possible for them to come up and say that the millions of dollars that are wasted on trying to do this are not in their hands, because it is directly related to trying to influence government that this exists. Now, I would like to go on with the first part of my model. Firstly, environmental advocacy groups are groups such as Ocean Conservancy, Worldwide Fund for Nature, that promote the harmful effects of climate change, raise awareness about these issues, and generate funds to donate to the cause. Secondly, lobbying governments is spending large sums of money on supporting government and political campaigns to support climate change and their cause and bring awareness. What does this look like? This looks like large companies being exploited by working for the government, because governments have a lot of other things to look at on their plate, and furthermore because they do not have a lot of money to waste on trying to quote these governments. What we propose instead is, firstly, reaching out to individuals specifically. This will be done by holding climate change campaigns and raising awareness for environmental change occurs by giving out flyers, damage control, etc. Secondly, reaching out to the public directly over harmful social media, about harmful effects by social media, etc., to gain a larger number of people who understand the cause. And thirdly, holding fundraisers to gain funds, etc. We will also, as a part of our model, fourthly, call out previous bad climate change policies, which is how on our side we will engage the government instead of having them impose new legislation which might not work. We believe that side propositions need to consider these things in our argument today, which is what I'm going to elaborate on. For my first argument then, environmental advocacy groups are less likely to gain funds or awareness on their side of the house. What are the reasons for this? Firstly, environmental groups tend to be smaller advocacy groups that have lesser funds inherently because of how small their numbers are, etc., which means they can only devote them to one thing. Secondly, it is because it is extremely difficult for them to lobby governments in the first place. This is because lobbying governments often requires these groups to pay political parties in order to support their cause, which they do not have enough money and resources to do this. It is extremely difficult to do this. B, it requires them to actively support a political party, such as Democrats, to gain funds. For them, this looks like going to each of their political elections, trying to actively campaign for them and going to support, which is too much of time and effort wasted. And thirdly, then, governments are likely to be corrupt, therefore they are not likely to support either one side. What are the consequences of this? Firstly, because these groups have lesser money, etc., they are then less likely to be able to actually generate funds to mitigate climate change in the first place or help social causes. Secondly, they're more likely to experience backlash for associating with the government and political parties in the first place. This is something that I will be further explaining in my second argument, how our side specifically solves the problem. Because firstly, because our science contains things such as going directly to the people and sending out flyers, creating funds, etc., it therefore means we have more money on our side of the house. And secondly, because we're not wasting them on trying to get government to support us, we have therefore more money, and we raise awareness directly to the people. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so because you talked about like reducing ice cover, how do you address the fact that only 100 investors and state-owned fossil fuel companies are responsible for around 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions, meaning that individuals all over the world are only responsible for the net 30%. Also, during COVID, even though we were locked up and not using cars, airplanes, and so on, we still had record emissions in May 2020. How do you suggest then that individual contributions are responsible for climate change and addressing individual contributions can solve climate change if what is responsible for climate change is industry and government? How are you going to resolve this contradiction? Even though you might get more individuals to support you, what is that going to result in? Is it going to result in any effective change at all?
Okay, what we're talking about here is creating methods to actually solve climate change rather than people who are going to be reducing it. So the way our side approaches it is by creating awareness and getting more people to actually pay attention to these causes, which I think is going to be more effective rather than causing these corporations to stop by legislation. Now moving on to my second argument, climate change groups are less likely to have support because of many reasons, and this means they have lesser money again. This is firstly because of the lack of visibility that is caused by lobbying parties. This is because persuading politicians, etc., requires a lot of backdrop meetings, which means that the general public sees people only sees these climate change groups only associating with the government rather than actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. Secondly, the image of these people affiliating and associating with politics is very harmful and disruptive, because it further leads the public to believe that they're only cared about gaining political support and not actually about climate change or environmental policies. Thirdly, politics has opposing parties, which means that if they approach a specific political party for their support, etc., it means that the opposing party now will deny climate change, which means that 50% of the population will stop believing in it or denying it. Or secondly, that it will cause a lot of problems. How our policy solves this problem? We go door to door to people, and we ask them to genuinely believe in climate change. We hold fundraisers, etc., which shows people that we are actually concerned about climate change as opposed to our perception of dealing with politics. And thirdly, we have more money on our side of the house. This is important because at the end of the day, it is climate change that we should be concerned about, and not politics and not other things that might cause people to reduce the importance of given to climate change because of these political means. We believe that on our side of the house, we have a lot more money and effort that we put into climate change as opposed to their side of the house, which is why we win this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech and request the second speaker from proposition to continue the proposition case. Aruna, here.
Firstly, we have to understand the motion at hand. It is to prioritize government lobbying to change environment policies and not abandon personal responsibility as a whole, meaning that can be done, but government legislation has to be prioritized. Why does it have to be prioritized? Let's look at the second part of the motion. Individuals to take responsibility for their contributions to environmental damage. Now that to me sounds like if I come and murder you and then ask you to take responsibility for your murder. That's not how it works. It's just simply a form of victim blaming. Individuals are the victims of climate change, not the perpetrators of it. And this is exactly the sort of rhetoric that the 100 fossil fuel companies who are responsible for climate change would like. This is the framework that they would like us to think in. And hence, I would also put forward the argument that when climate activists or side opposition today were to engage in this sort of rhetoric, they're just furthering such corporate propaganda, as I will demonstrate in my case. Let me summarize my case. 1, individuals are not responsible for climate change. 2, individual action for climate change is corporate propaganda and a distraction. 3, individuals cannot create an effective impact on climate change. Okay, let's start with individuals are not responsible for climate change. I've already stated that only 100 investors in state-owned fossil fuel companies are responsible for around 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And also the other greenhouse gas emissions that are caused, they're caused by, for example, transport emissions that result from private transportation. Why does that take place? Because there's a lack of effective public transportation, not because the person in question wants to emit those greenhouse gases. Even when individuals contribute to global warming in a minuscule, negligible manner, it's because they do not have alternatives. They are forced to. Blaming them is not the right choice. For example, if you observe in COVID, when all of us are locked up, we cannot travel, we cannot use cars. Even then, we had record emissions in May 2020. Now, let me talk about how individual action for climate change is corporate propaganda or a distraction. Let's start with British Petroleum, the company that created the term carbon footprint. Do you know why it did that? To distract the public from the fact that it created the world's largest oil spill. The Gulf of Mexico spill that is still ongoing, hasn't stopped yet, happened 20 years ago. So to distract people from that, it created a carbon footprint which measured people's carbon footprint and told them how to change it, while it itself was only contributing about 2.3% of its budget on renewable energy and still makes billions of dollars from fossil fuels, which are the prime reason for global greenhouse gas emissions. So coming from that understanding, let's go to how individuals cannot create an effective effect on climate change. Let's understand 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions, for example, come from electricity. Now, if I were to not use electricity, that electricity would just be dumped back on the grid. It doesn't matter if I use the electricity or use it less. It matters how it is produced in the first place. Is that grid sustainable? For example, come to the next example, transport. 14% of emissions come from transport. Now, out of that small 14%, only 7% of that 14% comes from commercial usage aircraft, and around 42% come from passenger cars, which I've already demonstrated are used because of a lack of effective public transport. The rest comes from industrial transportation, from trucking. That can't be changed by consumers. They play no role in it. That is why the opposition's argument falls at face value, because there is no individual contribution to climate change. And even if there is, it's because of a lack of alternative. Now, let's talk about a case study. What happens when people try to individually, sort of defeat climate change? Let me take the example of Steven Donziger, a man I look up to a lot. He is a lawyer who won a multi-billion-dollar judgment against Chevron, one of those fossil fuel companies. Do you know what has happened to him? Chevron has used billions of dollars to make sure that in a Bright case, he's locked in his house under house arrest, under a crime which the maximum sentence of which is 3 months, but he's still under house arrest for 1 year now. Meaning that if individuals were to take up the cause and try to fight against these fossil fuel companies that are responsible for climate change, they would simply be destroyed by their wrath. Meaning that the only entity which is responsible for protecting the public in all situations like war and similarly in climate change is the government. So now, let me give some sort of charity to the side opposition and say, yes, individual actions are responsible, but they're negligible compared to what is actually required to defeat climate change. And let's talk about some ineffective areas of individual responses. When individual responses are effective, they're not effective enough. And also, only people with privilege can afford to do them. Also, they require the support of government policy. For example, if I were to use electric cars, I can't do that because there's not enough promotion of electric charging in my city to adapt to that. That will require government policy. That will require the transport industry to be shifted to the paradigm of electric vehicles. Only people with privilege can do that. Let me make a, okay. So I'll take a POI now. Go ahead.
Okay, so you said that it is the individuals who cannot make change. However, don't you think that the companies that are being run are firstly being run by individuals, and secondly, when they're forced to abide by a law that they do not agree, is at the point at which they'll riot more and they'll pay lesser attention to climate change?
No, I don't believe that. I think these companies should be treated exactly like we treated Nazi Germany in World War II. It's an entity that can be defeated with enough political willpower. They're responsible. If we do not effectively hold them accountable, they will be responsible for mass extinction of human beings. Now, again, coming back to also pushing for individual lifestyle changes, actually shown through scientific study, reduces support for more comprehensive changes that are required. For example, a carbon tax that was floated in Australia reduced support for more comprehensive setbacks on the fossil fuel industry in Australia, which, for example, they're trying to set up the Dakota pipeline or trying to start oil rigging in the Great Bight. I would like to conclude by saying fighting climate change requires pragmatic activists and not martyrs for no cause. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and request the second speaker from opposition to continue the opposition case. Tamanna, here.
3, 2, 1. As my first speaker clearly established, on proposition side of the House, lobbying with governments would ultimately lead to politicizing important environmental issues that would be more detrimental to our society and the cause stand against the cause these environmental advocacy groups fight for in the first place. Before I go on to dive into the arguments, let me first address a few claims that were brought out by the proposition today. The first speaker, when they were talking about modality 1, they talked about individual awareness. Even in their own speech, they're prioritizing individual awareness above all. Secondly, they emphasized on legislations being passed, but the question we raise is, isn't it important that individuals should know how to implement or follow these? And isn't it important that these rules and laws are enforced properly? Thirdly, they also talked about stern legislations against plastic. Two responses to that. Number one, is your government willing to clash with corporations that produce plastics? If so, secondly, how do you propose to lobby governments in such a way? Thirdly, isn't it an individual awareness required to not use plastic? Anyway, fourthly, the second speaker of the proposition mentioned about how we are the victims of climate change and not the perpetrators, which is quite paradoxical considering that first speaker went on and on about mentioning plastics and how we can control the use of plastic by going on to school level awareness campaigns. Well, anyway, continuing from where my first speaker left, we'd like to say that governments are unlikely to support climate change groups to bring about change because they have other important issues to look at. What this means is three things. Number one, political parties are unlikely to place environmental issues as their first priority. Let's take an example of a study conducted on the national climate change policy in Finland, a corporatist European country that has long lacked ambitious climatic policies. The findings of these studies showed that a coalition that prioritized economic competitiveness over climate change mitigation was more influential and occupied a central position in the policy network. Similarly, most political parties or governments lack the political will to advocate for environment change and still consider it to be secondary to the other issues that are on their plate. Secondly, lobbying with governments would basically mean these environmental advocacy groups are left vulnerable on their hands and are exploited. Three reasons that we use to substantiate this. Number one, advocacy groups can never be sure if the governments will even implement these policies, even if they support them in elections. The fickle nature of governments and their drive for securing vote banks would ultimately lead to days or months of negotiations going down the drain. Secondly, even if they do put these laws in place, environmental and climate change policies, there's no guarantee that these laws will be enforced and implemented with due diligence. Now, lobbying governments, and I would like to bring this to the notice of the House, can only lead to formulation of policies, guidelines, and rules. We also have well-formulated traffic laws, but we still have busy policemen at the traffic signals, stopping from people jumping signals and driving without a license. This is because people are not trained to respect laws and values. Similarly, despite a 38-fold increase in environmental laws put in place since 1972, failure to fully implement and enforce these laws is one of the greatest challenges to mitigating climate change, reducing pollution, and preventing widespread species loss, a UN environment report suggests. Thirdly, and more importantly, even if these policies are implemented, we don't know if they will be repealed. Not only is it difficult for advocacy groups to negotiate with governments because of low resources, like mentioned by my first speaker, but also due to the instability brought by changing governments, lobbying with them is not a viable option. And that is what we take up here in this motion today. Taking the example of the Paris Accord, after the election of the Republican-led Trump government, USA formally withdrew from the international agreement, right? While under the Biden presidency, US did rejoin the pact, it stands to be an example why lobbying with governments won't work out. And before that, I'll take a POI.
Let's say that individuals do not face the same paradigm that you're saying, that they will be easily convinced that climate change is a serious problem, which I do not agree with because they won't be. But what will they do after? Let's say they're convinced. What will they do after? How will you counter climate change after that, even if you convince them?
Two things, sir. Number one, you have to understand that the citizens are at the heart of every nation, right? So even if governments do bring in your legislations, they will actually implement these legislations and follow these legislations with all of their conviction, right? That is one thing that we bring from individual awareness. Secondly, is that they can actually work against these corporations by forming unions and fight against the bad means of waste production or waste management that they're using. These are the two things that I'd like to give a response to that POI. Anyway, coming to the consequences that we might face on side proposition, two things: a loss of trust or drive for the cause. Whilst college students and big city liberals may understand the importance of environment conservation, almost like again my opposition said today, almost every blue collar worker today cares more about the economy. They tend to give precedence to issues like healthcare and taxes, and consider talks on environmental change to be of no significance. Further, associating environmental policies with certain governments will mean even more alienation of such masses from the issue or the cause that advocacy groups fight for. Secondly, we believe that more resources and capital is spent in negotiation with the government than actually focusing on the issue at hand. How we uniquely solve this problem on side opposition is that by proposing to invest in individual and citizen awareness, we on side opposition believe that this will help people to understand and attach to environmental issues and be more cognizant. This will further facilitate the working of these advocacy groups. I'd like to conclude by saying that instead of blindly following and trusting the government legislation as side proposition says, we believe that we need to build and produce environmentally conscious and cautious global citizens. The environment advocacy group should prioritize lobbying with individuals to educate them and make them aware about the environmental damage around us. On side opposition, we help advocacy groups reach the masses more efficiently and become allies to help their cause. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and request the third speaker from proposition, Anish, to conclude the constructive case for proposition. Here.
Right, I'm good to go. Should I give a countdown, or how does this work? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible and visible. Just count down to 3.
All right, 3, 2, 1. A very good day to everyone watching. I, Anish Kumar Arun, stand today with the proposition arguing that we must have environmental advocacy groups prioritizing government lobbying over convincing individuals to take responsibility over climate damage. So in order to provide context to my speech, I'll be splitting it into 2 major parts. First, arguing over why we shouldn't move over individuals taking responsibility, why we shouldn't spend too much effort on that. And secondly, why we need to prioritize government lobbying. So first of all, moving to my most important point, we have to look at who are the actual perpetrators here. While I will acknowledge the fact that there are certain things that we can do in our lifestyles to improve it, one thing is for sure, we are not the major perpetrators of that crisis. But in this case, that would be the major enterprises that have caused a huge amount of global warming over the past multiple decades. Me keeping my light on for 6 hours makes a negligible impact on the environment. Years and years of oil drilling, felling of acres upon acres of land, and well, I can spend the entirety of my 6 minutes harping on about the major issues caused by large-scale corporations that have caused this issue. Now, another very important point that I would bring that the opposition has quite blatantly missed out on, mobilizing the opposition is a pipe dream. It is unrealistic, it is not possible. First of all, as the second speaker of the proposition had mentioned, only 30% of the global population is accounted by domestic pollution, and even lesser percentage of which is caused by our carbon footprints. So it'll take all 7 billion of us to actively mobilize and change our lives to center an environmentally viable goal to have an 11% change in the environmental circumstances as it is today. According to me, it sounds like it's a waste of time, it's a waste of resources, and it is a waste of the entire work being put in by activists when they can prioritize taking the fight to the government and actually hoping for a positive output. Now, over here to actually explain why people over here can't really do much about the situation, I'll be splitting all of us into 2 groups. First, people who are forced to shape their life in a way that isn't environmentally friendly, and second, who do it because they are because of a force of habit and their life is intrinsically centered around it. First of all, a simple case: when a person has to take his bike to work, at extremely awkward times. He has no other option but to use the bike because there are no other public transport options to take him to his workplace. And again, because there might be a case that public transport isn't even plying at that time. His main goal is to put food on the table. He doesn't really care about the situation of the environment as long as he's able to sustain himself and his family. Even if he cares, he cannot take action. And secondly, as the opposition mentioned today, people do care. However, I argue against that. People say that they care. They don't necessarily care. This is a common example of bandwagon effect. There are so many people on Instagram who have pages talking about how the environment is in pain while they have their AC on, 5 lights on in the room, having 3 cameras on them to show, to have their face look brighter and better on camera. This is the problem, and this problem stems from human nature. And now I'll open up for POIs.
You repeatedly say that it is not individual action that can help climate change, but the example that you're giving of leaving your light bulb on for 6 hours, if everybody started doing that, don't you think that would waste a lot of electricity? And secondly, what you're saying just now about cameras, etc., that is also a direct thing of individual effect, not corporations doing it. So how do you respond?
What's interesting over here? This is a case of force. We are in an unwitting situation where we believe that this is the way out, something that is actually being perpetrated by all of you. You say that by spreading information, change will be made. How much more information do you need? All the information is with us. And that actually leads me on to my next point, why we do need government lobbying. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, there is quite a limited amount of work that we can do by just spreading information, because one, we have all the information, and secondly, we don't have the incentive to carry on with that information. Now, if we actually look at the government, because of how dependent we are on corporations, we can't do much, but the government can. And if we apply pressure on the government, now I am saying that the government has a nasty track record when it comes to it, but what other options do we have? The situation over here is so extreme that government lobbying might just be the only way out. And examples of that have been seen where government lobbying has worked. Example being the tobacco industry. Now, if you look at the tobacco industry, in the 1980s, anti-tobacco lobbies did try to move out to people, explain why smoking cigarettes were bad, but that never worked until they actually went to the government, lobbied aggressively, and pushed for fixed legislation that have had a lasting impact over 20 years, gravely reducing and saving us from a long-lasting tobacco epidemic. If that can be done, then why can we not push for something that is the defining battle of our future? And as I mentioned earlier, we probably won't make change on an individual level because of our vices, because of the situation around us. We are complacent with the fact that only information, by providing information, everything will become great again. But that won't work. Change will only come when we lobby for the government and they can actually pass laws that restrict us, that calls for an economic slowdown, reduce spending, reduce consumption, maybe even work on infrastructure, work on city planning, power grid development, make our lives more efficient. To conclude, all that I'd like to say is that imagining that we will do work, and I know it sounds hypocritical, but past experiences have shown that we cannot count on us to carry out work. We have all the information. What more do we want? We have all the tools, but we refuse to use it because of how comfortable we are. And with that, I rest my case, but not my stance. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and request the third speaker from opposition, Smayan, to conclude the opposition constructive case and the constructive debate as a whole. Here.
Yeah, just a second. I'm just setting a timer for myself. Can you just give me like a countdown, maybe?
Yeah, you can start in 3, 2, 1.
Good evening to the House at large. Today, I, Smayan, would like to continue the case for the opposition. Some astonishing claims have been made by the proposition tonight, and I'm here to convince you how the opposition side of the House is actually the correct one. Let me start. The first speaker from the proposition said that we need to create awareness among individuals and tell them to refrain from deeds which cause harm to the environment. So you also agree with our side of the House. Human intervention to all scales plays a decisive role to ensure that environmental protection is a shared responsibility of humanity. Of course, the carrying capacity of environmental sources is also a natural mechanism of environmental remediation, but it is human shared responsibility to consume, behave, act, and appreciate natural sources. The first speaker also said that achieving changes on the environmental front is not easy. The opposition agrees with you on this point, which is why we raised the point that the environmental advocacy group should prioritize lobbying with individuals to advocate them, to educate them and make them aware about the environmental damage being done all around us. The best option would be to maximize lobbying at school level so that the awareness and values could be imbibed into the young, impressionable minds, and we create a more responsible population of aware citizens. However, the government cannot achieve conservation at an individual level. To start with, supremacy cannot implement laws and regulations forcefully on the individuals of this society. The first speaker further gave example of some recent and serious floods in Indian cities, citing the main culprit for the floods as the plastic bottles and other items. You believe that we need to compel the government to pass strict legislation for plastic substances. However, do you think that the government, which has only 543 members in the Lok Sabha and 245 members in the Rajya Sabha, can actually prevent 138 crore Indians from using plastic? On the flip side, an individual is obligated to take care of the environment. Firstly, people can start using plastic products instead of plastics on their own. Some research elucidated that there has been a sharp decline in the number of environmental hazards in cities where people refuse the usage of plastic. This step will stop production of plastic because of less demand in society. Moreover, people also limit their unnecessary paper, water, and electric usage. Resultantly, smart usage of them will definitely save trees and water resources of our environment. Moving on, the first speaker said that Bhutan is a plastic-free state because plastic is prohibited by law. However, 20 years after Bhutan first banned the use and sale of plastic carry bags, Doma wrappers, and ice cream pouches, the ban was reinforced nationwide again on April 1, 2019 because it did not work, and the ban is still only an ongoing process. Lastly, the first speaker's speech was mainly based on the argument that we need to ban production and not consumption. I would like to rebut this point with the anti-cracker campaign of Delhi. The government imposed all kinds of restrictions on burning of firecrackers in Delhi, including a ban on their sale. But we all know that people can still illegally buy crackers in Delhi easily. However, children across Delhi spearheaded the anti-cracker campaign. They decided that they will not burn crackers. They told their parents that, and that they don't want to burn firecrackers. And that's where the real change came from. So this shows how the government banning production won't work. But if the people take an initiative, they can certainly save the environment. Going ahead, the second speaker's whole speech was based on the issue of climate change. However, climate change is not the only environmental issue at hand. We are talking about environmental damage in general, and there are many other sources of environmental damage which the second speaker completely ignored. The second speaker further said that there is no individual contribution to climate change, but then you said that people can actually be considered responsible for climate change. Despite this gaping hole, the second speaker's speech was based largely on how individuals are not the cause of climate change. But this statement you made is completely baseless and outrageous to hear. By increasing the abundance of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, human activities are amplifying Earth's natural greenhouse effect. Virtually all climate scientists agree that this increase in heat trapping gases is the main reason for the 1.8 degree Fahrenheit rise in global average temperatures since the late 19th century. Before I move ahead, I would like to take a PY. Anish.
Right, thank you. So first of all, in the statistic that you mentioned, how you called our argument baseless, that human activity is the main cause. First of all, how can you say human activity when most of human activity actually involves the work done largely by the company? We talked about human activity in general. Only 11% of that human activity is domestic. If you work on the individual level and only secure that 11% of improvement, how can you work towards an overall change when companies are still looming large with their capitalist measures?
Okay, thank you for the question. First of all, even if we make that 11% cut, it still makes a huge difference. Like 11% is a huge statistic. And secondly, if humans make the change themselves, then industries and companies automatically have to cut down their production. I mean, if there's no demand, then why will there be any production or supply? Moving on, the second speaker also said that there is not enough promotion of electric cars in our city. So people will never make a shift. But in Delhi, many groups have lobbied, and as a result, the government is promoting the use of electric vehicles. It is giving a subsidy, and the Delhi government has launched the Switch Delhi campaign. But the decision to buy an electric car is still that of an individual, and unless they are aware and their mindset changes, there will be no change in the ground situation. So for any genuine change, the people also have to be convinced, and they are the ultimate change makers. I'd like to now conclude my speech. It is difficult to take any arguments from the proposition speech apart from A, production of things, which we already counted, and B, it is not individuals who can make any change, which is a contradiction, which was also pointed out by the second speaker. I feel that the proposition is living in an unrealistic and idealistic world where they believe that the government is an entity that can solve any problem and that the people will obey them without any apprehension and resentment. Whereas the truth at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, is that no real environmental benefit can come if environmental advocacy groups start lobbying governments to change environmental policies rather than convincing individuals to take responsibility for their own contribution to environmental damage. Because the reality is that the actual change has to come from the people. As Robert Swan once rightly said, the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech and all 6 speakers for that constructive debate. Can we please request the opposition reply speaker, Sarah, to deliver the opposition reply speech? Here.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Side proposition failed to completely back this case in today's debate because of the first logical and complete fallacy that they admitted in all their arguments. They never once mentioned the advocacy groups that we are supposed to be debating about today. We told you that it is extremely difficult for these groups to actually go ahead and lobby governments because it takes a lot of money to firstly lobby governments, and secondly, a lot of time and effort that is put into supporting a specific political party and going to campaigns, etc. Never once engaged with this argument and never once told us how they exactly decide to go about lobbying governments on how they will so-called impose legislation that they've been talking about throughout their entire speeches. We think that this is a complete logical argument because we told you about the harmful effects and how it is very difficult to start lobbying. However, they never once covered this in their speech, in their model or anywhere. Secondly, then, we told you that it is if individuals do not agree with the law themselves, they will therefore riot, and it does not mean that even if you do impose a law, that people will actually implement it into their daily beings. This again was completely not engaged with side proposition, which is why we furthermore win this clash point. And furthermore, they completely went on about saying that how it is individual damage that might cause climate change, however contradicted this in their very first speech when they told us it is companies, etc., that do this. Furthermore, this is easily countered by what we told you about how these companies can riot if they do not agree with change. And furthermore, what our third opposition speaker told you about how change actually only comes when individuals agree with it. Now, secondly, then, for our argument that we told you about how individuals themselves are less likely to be in favor of likely to implement climate change when they believe that advocacy groups are only care about political things. They did not ever once engage with this in either of their arguments, because we told you that that these individuals are less likely to be supporting these groups, which is the main funding, which is by volunteer work and furthermore by fundraisers that these advocacy groups hold. This is how these advocacy groups firstly get money in the first place. And if you do not have individuals backing them up, like we told you in our arguments, then they do not have any money, which is something that furthermore side proposition went on ignoring in today's debate. Our third proposition speaker also told you the problem with how governments function and about how governments might choose to not implement this regulation about after a certain period of time, and how it is completely dangerous for environmental groups to go ahead and create legislation because they do not have any assurance for when they will stop implementing this legislation, or how it will be implemented, or how many people would abide by it. This was furthermore a problem that we identified, which they certainly did not reply to. Side proposition's entire 3 speeches were about examples and filled with how they contradict themselves about whether individuals cause climate change or not, or if it's companies. However, they never once paid any heed to any of the points that we brought up in with their stance and in this debate, which is why side opposition wins in this debate today. So proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech, and to conclude the case for proposition and to draw a conclusion for the debate as a whole, I'd like to request the proposition reply speaker, Arnav, to conclude the case for proposition. Here.
Can I start now, ma'am? Am I visible and audible? Go. So firstly, we have to understand the difference between human activity and individual activity. Human activity meaning activity done by human beings as a species, individual activity being activities done by individuals. Human activity causes environmental issues and climate change, not individual activity. Understand this. Corporations are not individuals. Let's move on. Another contradiction. It was said that the primary fulcrum of the side proposition's argument is that it is not going to be effective. I asked a simple question. Even after you raise awareness, even after you rally citizens to, let's say, to take climate change seriously, what are you going to do? Nothing they can do is in their hands, because the majority of environmental issues, the most serious environmental issues, are caused by sort of paradigms that are completely outside their control. Now, coming back to, let's say, claims that, I mean, I was phrased as a climate denier, so that is a complete mischaracterization of my speech, but let's move on. Let's understand the motion again. Prioritize. The side proposition doesn't say that individual action is not important. It is, but negligible. What is more important is to have strong laws that govern these the greedy fossil fuel companies that are responsible for a majority of environmental issues and a majority of the climate crisis, and not individual action. Next, I would like to go on to say that, for example, the effectiveness of the firecracker ban, perhaps. The reason that those school children decided to not participate in that firecracker is because that there were laws that were implemented that called for schools to participate in education around climate change from the state, meaning that change came from the state itself as well. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the fact that the side opposition has completely failed to engage with the main fulcrum of the argument, that individuals are ineffective in responding to climate change because individuals are not responsible for climate change. They fail to address this. They fail to talk about proportional responsibility allocation. They fail to address the fact that individuals are in fact victims of climate change. Such self-martyrdom perhaps is appealing. Such rugged individualism is perhaps appealing in in times of such lack of hope. But what we have to be is pragmatic and committed as environmental lobby groups and demand legislation, because legislation is what can effectively counter the entities responsible for a majority of environmental issues. Now let's come to other environmental issues. Let's say conservation of forests. Will you expect individuals to do it? Not possible logistically. Other environmental issues, like let's say sustainable agriculture. Individuals have to be incentivized, have to be nudged to do it. They cannot take that on themselves. Let's conclude by saying I'm proud to be on side proposition simply because I'm not putting forward fossil fuel propaganda. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful speeches and all the debaters for what was a really engaging and incredible debate. Just in terms of process, Anjali, Kamal, would you quickly tell us how much time we have, whether we should be conferring, and how we do the decision at the end?
Having experienced you as an educator, Varshini and Dhruva, it will be our pleasure for you to take a little time, give them the verdict and give them the feedback, because I know it's a very valuable session. I'm sure all the people in the audience can stretch it for another 10-15 minutes.
Okay, so we actually do have a decision, and unfortunately, as it was, between Dhruva and I, we had a split decision, and I gave it to proposition West Bengal. Dhruva gave it to opposition Delhi. So we actually sought out the external weigh-in from AugLi, and just to promise you that this decision was all made independently, we actually asked for their decision before we turned our ballots in, just to ensure that there was impartiality in the process. And they voted for opposition Delhi as well. And as a result, we have a 2-1 split decision in favor of Delhi. I'm really, really sorry. This was by a hair's breadth to West Bengal, but huge congratulations to Delhi for winning the Indian Debate League. So I think you guys should be really, really proud of yourselves, both teams. Give yourselves a pat on the back, hopefully do some kind of virtual handshake if you're able to. Congratulations to Delhi and commiserations to West Bengal. I can quickly go through.
Thank you so much.
Let me just give you guys, I think, 30 seconds before I start laying things on to both teams, and then have Dhruva weigh in as well in a second.
It was a pleasure debating against you. Thank you.
It was really wonderful debating against you too. We learned a lot.
You guys were great.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the best debates I've ever attended. Definitely.
Fantastic. So much fun.
Okay, so we actually thought, both of us, Dhruva and I, thought this was actually a really close and really good round. I'm quickly going to go through, I think, why I saw the debate the way I did, but I really did think that, I think I knew that we were going to split on the vote, because I think the debate was difficult to judge. Rightly so, because I think a final debate should be difficult to judge and should be a split decision. So I'm quickly going to go over my reasoning, and then I am going to let Dhruva go through his, and then we can both do a piece of feedback each per speaker if that's useful to all 6 speakers in the room. Okay, so for me in general, this is a debate about how social movements should operate and what advocacy groups should do, right? And usually, and I think this happened in this debate as well, these debates boil down to 3 questions. First is, what is the right thing to do in this situation, right? So it is assuming that everything works. What is the outcome we would like for a social movement to have? Would we fundamentally like for laws to be passed, or would we fundamentally like for individual people to drive changes? The second question is around strategy. Which is a strategy, even if the outcome might be, contested, what is more likely to work as a strategy for the social movement? So is it more likely to work if they lobby governments, and will they get the outcome they want? Or is it more likely that they will convince people and as a result get the outcome they want? And finally, there's a question around support and funding, which is what is more likely to gather and garner more support and funding for social movements? And that's basically the 3 sort of things that in general, I think these sorts of debates boil down to. And as expected, I think those were the broad issues that the 2 teams were debating as well. And here's how it went for me. First, on just the question of strategy, right? I think opposition was able to show very clearly, and this is something I did credit to opposition, that social movements do not have the capital in terms of money and influence and power to change the minds of governments, because this takes billions of dollars, is something that corporations historically have been better at doing. And as a result, social movements really cannot change the minds of governments. Unfortunately, we don't quite hear a response from proposition on this, except for a broad idea from third that, we have done this in the past. It has happened with the anti-tobacco lobby. We don't quite know what the reasons are for why it worked or how it played out, but we do get some sort of mitigation as response to this. And therefore, I think I bought personally that social movements would not be able to change the minds of legislators. However, for me, what was glaring then was that I don't think opposition was able to show me that social movements would be able to change the minds of people, or why it would work to change the minds of people, or why they are particularly uniquely good at changing the minds of people, rather than changing the minds of government. So I think you showed me that proposition's strategy does not work, but I don't think we got positive reasons for why opposition strategy does work. And I think for me, that was something that made the debate really confusing, because then I had to judge the debate based on what was then the other 2 questions around, do we actually think climate change is driven more by people or more by sort of corporations who needed to be limited by governments? I will also say that from proposition, we got some idea, even though it was not as clearly built out and it was not clearly contested. We got this idea that there are lots more people to convince, and therefore it is much more difficult for social movements to convince them. So as a result, I don't quite think this question of whether it works went clearly to either team, even though I think to some extent Op showed that social movements can't convince governments. Then there was a question of support, where I think opposition shows that, you'll spend a lot of money lobbying, and therefore you will not have as much money to do other things. But it was not clear to me what you were doing convincing people and how much resources you were spending there, and how those resources compared to the amount of resources you spent lobbying. And as a result, I didn't think that was individually creditable to me. And so those 2 questions played out in that way in the entire debate. It then therefore boiled down to whether climate change and its harms were something that you can actually tackle through people's contributions, individual contributions, or whether you needed government limitations of corporations. I think proposition was able to prove pretty clearly that corporations have a much bigger impact, and that a lot of the propaganda around individual changes are actually just us being the mouthpiece of big oil or big tobacco lobbies. And in that sense, to me, then it was, if it's the case that it's not clear that either strategy will work, which is what it was, then I'd much rather that a social movement at least champions the truth And in that sense, I don't think opposition was able to show me that people's contributions were bad enough or high enough. And I wasn't sure what kinds of contributions they were expecting from people that would actually change, for example, corporations' behaviors. We do get a bit of an example of, say, electric cars, etc., and what you can buy in consumerism towards the end of third opposition. But I don't think that was enough to show me that this impact is meaningful. And in that sense, I thought proposition took the debate pretty narrowly. My ballot has the debate to proposition by half a point.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Vaishni. I feel like the explanation of that decision made clear just how close the debate was, and that certainly reflected on my ballot and my thinking about the debate as well. But I wanted to input on where I differed and why I thought that opposition took this debate. So I agree with Vaishni that broadly speaking, those were the three big things. The first is who is to blame, individuals or corporations? And proposition had a really convincing case for why corporations had the majority of blame to face for climate change. However, I think they acknowledged that individuals also did contribute to climate change. And this is something that as the debate went along, it got more and more murky. So for instance, by third proposition, there was agreement that it was that we were not, individuals may not be the major perpetrators of the crisis, but that suggests that they are perpetrators nonetheless. The second part of it that opposition proved that I think West Bengal didn't come back on is that any potential solution will also need people to buy into it. So whether that is people being able to go around firecracker bans, or if it's people needing to take the initiative to buy a green car in order to use it, even if the sockets are all available, any solution will need people to buy in as well. So at the end of that, I agreed with proposition that the majority of harm came from corporations, but thought that people also had something to contribute to this. However, where the debate really did go to opposition for me were the other 2 points, because I think opposition did show that environmental groups would be really, really bad at succeeding in changing the minds of governments and pushing them to and there would be an ineffective use of their resources to try and change government policy. And I think proposition was missing clear reasons for why and how environmental groups could change governmental policy, rather than going back to examples and saying we have the tobacco example, or this is like Nazi Germany and we should do everything we can to change it. So proposition, I think, could have quite easily won this round if they had put in a set of reasons for why governments would change and the tools that environmental groups could use to change the minds of governments. Whereas opposition, I agree, didn't do enough on explaining on the flip side why individuals are easier to change the minds of. But I think that's something that both teams, at least earlier on the debate, agreed on, and that there was not as much challenge on from proposition. And I think that this meant that narrowly opposition took the question of efficacy in change by saying that governments are basically impossible to change the minds of. People, there's some ways to change their minds. We've seen some examples of where it's been successful. So I think on balance, that went narrowly to opposition for me. However, clearly where opposition did not receive much response was on the question of support. So opposition argued right from first op that environmental movements need people to show up and volunteer, need them to provide funds in order to in order for them to be able to do anything at all. And that if you align with one political party or the other, or see yourself being embroiled in these long and ineffective political negotiations, people will stop trusting you and stop showing up and stop funding you. And that'll make everything that you do less effective. And I think given that that was a pretty strong attack coming right from first op and carried through to op reply, it really did need a response from proposition, and I didn't hear one all throughout. So on a very narrow margin and in a close but messy debate, I gave it to side opposition, and given that the panel from AugLi agreed with that as well, the debate ended up going to side opposition.
very quickly, if I may announce this, I did want to say that despite disagreeing on the decision, I think Dhruva and I do have a clear final best speaker. Is that something we can announce, Anjali?
Yes, Varshini, please go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly congratulate Sarah, who on both our score sheets does have the highest score in the round, and we thought had the best speech in the round. So I just wanted to say congratulations on that speech.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Sarah. Thank you so much, Varshini and Dhruva. This was very detailed feedback. I'd really call upon the participants. If you have any questions, this is literally a piece of gold time that you have. Please feel free to ask anything that you'd ask the adjudicators.
Yeah, feel free.
Okay, so I understand the two areas of the debate where we lacked, and I understand that now post-debate, that is, we had to show how our strategy of targeting government would have been more effective, and also we would have to show that our strategy, our measures would gain more support and popularity. Let's say on the second one first, if we were to say that in today's time, a broad anti-capitalist movement would gain large support throughout the globe without even having to bring in the environment as a cause, and that itself would address the environment, would that have leaned the debate to our side?
And I think that's a very strong point in terms of setting the context. And I think your team did very well in using examples and drawing on real world issues to set the context in which this debate operates. But if you think about it, that's still not a reason, right? You need to explain why is it that people are more likely to buy into a broad anti-capitalist framework than buy into individual things. And this could be as simple as saying people don't like being lectured and like being told that what they're doing is wrong. Therefore, they're much more likely to support an environmental movement that points to the government as the cause of the problem and pushes for governmental change. People are set in their ways and will find it hard and unwilling to change their behaviors. They're much more willing to put in some time and effort to rail against a government which is unpopular for other reasons as well, as we see with XYZ. So you need to be thinking in terms of what are logical reasons we can provide for our arguments, rather than what are examples we can draw on or contextual factors that we can use to frame the argument.
Got it. And I think that resolves that side for me. I got what you're suggesting largely. For the strategy end of it, yeah, I mean, it was pointed out that we did have one thing, that the scale here would be smaller if you're targeting state and one entity rather than targeting, like, let's say, a lot of individuals. If we would have suggested the strategy that if environmental lobbies were to, for example, form a coalition and target one entity as a whole, and like when you have a clear goal, you know, instead of aspiring for individual virtue, when you have a clear goal, it is easier to identify it and work towards it. Would that work as strategy, or would you suggest something else as well?
I think that's the first step, Arnav. And then the next step after that is to say, okay, they have this goal. What are the things they're doing in order to achieve that goal? So this looks like showing up at government hearings and providing the perspective of the environmental movement. It looks like writing out legislation. So you can look at the kinds of things the Sunrise Movement does in the US. They literally write legislation and spend a lot of time and resources writing out these laws that they then hand over to governments and officials to say, look, I know you guys are busy, you have lots on your plate, just take this bill that we have written and push it through parliament. Those are the sorts of things that it would look like to try and change the minds of policymakers. It could look like advising political parties. I think there's lots of things that you can think through and that the environmental movement does do in the status quo. But currently what was missing was a clear vision in my head of what does lobbying governments even look like within this debate, whereas at least we had some sense of it coming out of opposition and what changing the minds of people could look like, because they talked about awareness campaigns and stuff.
Just quickly wanted to add to that, another really common one is lots of policymakers currently, especially on the other side, are able to get away with this is an economic benefit. So lots of environmental advocacy groups also do cost benefit analysis that show you how you can actually save jobs or create more jobs by transitioning to green energy, how you actually are able to spur GDP growth, and why you have more energy if you transition sooner rather than if your coal reserves run out. So even publishing those studies as ways to move politicians on their current positions, as well as on the comparative, showing the extent of resources it would take to create change en masse. Because at the end of the day, changing 1 or 2 people and getting them to save a few drops of water is not what makes the difference. You will literally need to change people's minds in the millions. So what is, on average, what does that look like in terms of having a billboard out and competing with a really rich corporation on that type of advertising is something that's necessary as well on the flip side.
Got it. Got both of those things. One more contentious aspect of the debate that I chose to leave out of my constructives at the last moment was that the most effective sort of individual action for me towards making any difference in climate change is political violence directed at fossil fuel companies and Western governments. So let's say if we say that, that if you're going to encourage individuals to do that, that is the only thing that is going to make change. So why not try to do it in a more constructive manner? Would that make any difference in the debate, or like, did I make the right call in leaving that out, or did I make the wrong call?
I'm not quite sure where that will have gone, because I think the strongest stuff from opposition, which I don't think they quite said, was actually convincing people to go out and vote for green politicians. Yeah. Convincing people to boycott consumer goods that are environmentally unfriendly. Those both have a direct impact on legislation as well as on governments, but convince people, which is what the environmental movement is better at doing, because they are better at going door to door relative to spending a bunch of money on a politician. So I don't necessarily know that opposition will go the route of political violence. If they went the route of political violence, I think the debate changes and proposition is much more able to flip and talk about why lots of people would disengage with the environmental movement, why political violence makes it easier to sympathize with corporations, and overall just makes it harder for you to support environmentalism, of course. But I would wait for opposition to give us what they mean and whether that's what they'd run with, rather than making that assumption.
Got it.
Perfect. Any further questions? I know we are out of time.
Yes.
Yes.
Is there any personal feedback from me for the way I went about my debating as the whip?
I would say think about the copious theme-wise feedback that we have given and reflect on which of those you could have implemented in your own speech. And I think that exercise will be way more valuable than us trying to break it down for you. So say, I was third opposition. Here are the big issues that proposition and opposition mentioned. What could I have done differently in my speech to have changed Varshini's minds on XYZ issues, and that I did not do, and then go away and redo your speech tonight? And I think that will do more for your debating than us spending, 5 minutes giving one line of feedback to each student, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that for sure.
I have a final question, if it's possible to address it. How could I have prioritized my arguments better and sort of improved on the solvency aspect of it in my speech, if you could elaborate?
So without cheating and giving you individual feedback that Dhruva has just said he will not do for Smayan, in general, I think opposition needed to, in every argument, be very conscious and compare. So when you say, here are the 3 reasons the environmental movement cannot convince a politician and change their mind, you absolutely have to end that sentence with, and in contrast, here is why they are particularly excellent at changing the minds of people on the ground, and giving us 2 reasons for that. Similarly, here, just across the board and as a case, the 3 of you should have had reasons for why people, 1, do actually contribute to environmental damage, and 2, even if they do not, have the ability to change corporations and politicians who do contribute to environmental damage. And I think that was missing across the case, not just your speech. If the question is how do we get better at doing that, you just have to practice lots of debating and ensure that your case covers more aspects than just will what they're doing work.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. With that, I'm so glad that you took out the time to give detailed feedbacks to the team. So team West Bengal, please cheer up as well. You guys were equally good. I'm telling you, I was behind the scenes. It was so close. It's fabulous that they could pull out a judgment. You know, and I'm just, it's just so heartening to see the vision come to life. The fact is that when we started with this format of Indian Debating League, the idea was to ensure and encourage discussions on the topics that truly will matter. So, you know, thank you so much for bringing these SDGs alive. I'm sure it's awakened many more minds than we have anticipated or realized. Because every debater who has prepared it around the whole family, and you know how that sort of magnifies the impact across the country. So thank you so much for allowing us to sort of fulfill that vision. We are very thankful for it, but I'm happy to hear from anyone who wants to just say a quick line on how they felt about the format or any feedback. It will be a pleasure to hear it as well.
I had a great week debating with you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes,
Arna.
likewise. The format was really nice and all the debaters had like a lot of good constructors. So it was a very good learning experience.
Lovely. With that, I can see I'm between you and your dinner. We've had a long day. So please keep debating and we'll be in touch and look forward to many more sessions. Thank you so much, Dhruva, and thank you so much, Varshini, for joining us today. And thank you, debaters. Yes, Arnav, I think you raised a hand.
Thank you, everyone.
I don't want to spoil the flow of the conversation, but we will be receiving individual certificates, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. We are intending to enjoy our Sunday this time, and then after that, we'll be back on work on the rest of the
session. Thank you so much.
And the winning team would be going forth to national camp selections, right?
Yes, allow us to come back into details with that. But yes, I think the winning team deserves that pat in the back, right? Lovely. With that, good night to all of you, and thank you so much. With that, I call upon the closing of the Indian Debating League. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations, ma'am and sir, both of you,
Hi.
for the very successful event.
I think it got on to so long that I forgot what I had to say over our closing. But it's okay. I'll just snip it off on the recording table. Please help me do that. But Anne and Kamal and David, thank you so much. You guys were pretty much the wind beneath the wings. Thank you so much for making us look good. I think the event came off very well. Is it okay if you switch on your videos or not? So I should just put the one screenshot of the organizing team on. Yes, thank you so much. So nice to see you.
Congratulations, Anjali and Kamal.
Kamal, are you frozen?
No, I'm joining from the phone, so yeah, I'm out.
We'll have to go with your photograph as it's coming, but I can tell you, you're looking very amused and you seem very content in the picture that we see. Okay. So actually, I have nothing more to say. I think all of us should rest and enjoy our Sunday. We'll get back to
definitely
on Monday on a bunch of things to conclude it, but it was very satisfying, really. Thank you so much for allowing us to make this happen. Enjoy, people. Have a good dinner.